All right, everybody. Thank you so much for joining us tonight. On behalf of the American Visionary Art Museum, I want to welcome everyone to tonight's virtual program, a special tour of our exhibition, Esther and the Dream of One Loving Human Family, on International Holocaust Remembrance Day. Thank you for joining us. We just have a few reminders. Please send us your comments and questions in the chat box. We will have some time for Q&A at the end of the tour, and hopefully we can get to all your questions. And to start us off, I want to introduce AVM's founder, director, and principal curator, Rebecca Hofberger, to give us a welcome. Go ahead.
I just want to thank you, Becca, first off, for starting everything and to welcome everybody today. This is, I can't think of a more important time in our contemporary American history than right now to be coming together in a program like this, and with the daughter of Esther Krinitz with us, Bernice, my dear friend, because I think many of us who grew up with being friends with children of survivors, to knowing their parents, people firsthand. I'm going to be 69, so that was a big part of my childhood. Never thought that we would live to see what we have just seen, to see people in t-shirts in our capital saying Camp Auschwitz, saying, that 6 million not enough. I mean, such expressions of ugliness, and there's been a lot more. We saw the killing of George Floyd this year on camera, repeated around the world over and over. So what's great is that our exhibition, after being graced by the two daughters of Esther to show Esther's work previously, I think we were the first museum that was given the joy of sharing her work. And then it went to well over 40 museums around the world. And then to be asked to come up with a format to bring them back. And what I really wanted to do was to get at a better understanding of what I call this ancient evil that has been going on well before the European Holocaust. And that is looking at all the humanity's history of genocides, of demonization of people to catastrophic end, and to look at that as something that is that can swell up like a plague and take off like wildfire. And I'm reminded growing up of watching Wagon Train, and so many of the writers for Cowboys and for Wagon Train, and even Twilight Zone with Rod Serling, happened to be people, Jewish people who had relatives who had experienced, great, if not out and out, the Holocaust in Europe, had gone through pogrom, etc. And if you know that, you can kind of see it in Westerns and things, how it's set up. And when I was growing up, Wagon Train was a big show. And basically it was over and over again, the same story where the wagon master, who is wise, is trying to take a whole group of people across safely America to get out to the West. And almost always they would take a wrong path, and they would try to lynch up an innocent person thinking that they must be guilty. It was like the same show every year. And then right before disaster hit and the person was killed, the wagon master would come out and he would calm the crowd, and he would say something that appealed to their higher nature. And they would all realize, oh, they were wrong, and and peace would be made. And it was literally a formula show. It's interesting to watch it through the lens of knowing who wrote it. And so in this exhibition, I juxtapose with the phenomenal, most beloved works probably we've ever shown in the last 25 years, the 36 embroideries from Esther. Um, the works that we had in our permanent collection of embroideries that were in response to what was the worst day under apartheid people of color had lived in South Africa, and the commentary, the oral explanations for their embroideries that they had given. And we looked at America's treatment of Native Americans through works also by Native Americans. But we also did a focus on what happened in Rwanda, because you have people of the same skin color, but who nonetheless demonized a minority. And then when, famously the Hutu president was killed in the plane crash by his own people, the army decided to deflect it with saying it was those terrible, Tutsis who did it, and to catastrophic end where you had 800,000 people that were slaughtered in 100 days. So this exhibition, Esther and the Dream of One Loving Human Family, begins with the most inspirational thoughts from throughout time, from Maya Angelou to Pablo Casals to Theodore Roosevelt to Abraham Lincoln to Muhammad Ali, just putting as works of art the great Gandhi-esque, Martin Buber-esque, noble quotes about one human family. And so the exhibition that will be up for a full 5 years, so we still have like 3.5 years at least to go, is called Esther and the Dream of One Loving Human Family. And with all my heart, Bernice, I can never thank you enough for trusting in us and for being so generous with what is most precious to your whole family, and to share it with people whose lives are changed because they encountered your mom, who never intended that the work be seen by anybody but her own family, right?
Right.
With us, and the fact she didn't watch herself be an artist, she didn't think of herself as an artist, and she could not have been a greater artist. So thank you.
Thank you so much. It feels really like home to be with you, Rebecca, and with other staff from AVAM. I'm only missing being there in the museum, and but hopefully I'll get there. I'm
Can I just say one thing? We are reopened, but with shorter days. So our museum is totally open. You can come and see this. We do request that you buy time tickets on our website, avam.org, because that helps us really be very strict about the amount of people. We can only have 25% of our normal amount of people in the building. We have incredible COVID precautions, but we're open Wednesday through Sunday, 10 to 5. So I hope that many of you who see this will be inspired to come and to experience it in person.
Yes, because experiencing it in person is the best way. But tonight I am really honored to be with you on this day of all days, International Holocaust Remembrance Day, and to share with you something of my mother's art and story. When you come to the museum, or actually you can do this from home too, in the gallery with the exhibit is a film that runs on a loop. It's a 30-minute documentary film about my mother, and in which you can meet her. So I'm not going to show the whole film to you, but just a snippet, a 3-minute or so snippet, so that you can hear her voice and get a feeling for something of her story. And after that, I'm going to come back and just lead you through a number of images of her artwork. Again, the best way to appreciate it is to see it in person. So I do hope you can get to the museum. But in the meantime, I'll give you my tour of at least some of the works that you'll see. You can see the film and the artwork on our website, and maybe we can put the website address in the chat room for you. But in the meantime, let's turn to the film. It's called Through the Eye of the Needle. I always thought of my mother as different from other mothers. She sounded different from other mothers. She pronounced words differently, and she had a past that other mothers didn't have.
She loved to sew, she loved to embroider, she loved creating beautiful things. Our mother was very driven to tell the story. She wanted us to know it, she wanted us to remember.
It was a way of connecting me and my sister with the family that she had lost, her mother, her father, her sisters, her brother, nearly everyone that she loved in the world. At some point, she really began to look to me to be the storyteller. I had just read The Diary of Anne Frank, which came out around then. And so I started writing it. But I knew even then that nobody could really tell my mother's story. It was her story to tell.
I wanted to show my kids how I grew up. And I was trying desperately, but I never drew anything in my life. I said, well, I'm gonna try. So I bought this piece of cheap fabric and I thought I was just gonna mess around with. And I took a ruler and I still see my house the way it was. And I just drew the lines and then I started filling it out with acrylic work. And then I made this straw roof sort of. Now when I finished the house, I was really satisfied the way it looked. That's the way it looked.
And once she found that way, it just poured out of her.
Well, a taste, a little introduction to Esther. So I wanted now to show you a number of the pictures that she created. Some of you may have already been to the museum and seen them. Maybe some of you even saw them with me. And some of you may have seen the film, but in any case, we haven't done this program before, so I hope that you can take much away from it. So if you can bring up the first slide, please, Becca. This morning, I was in a Holocaust Remembrance program from Northern Ireland, which was amazing. So I feel this is really a very special day for me. This first picture you saw in the preview, this was my mother's house, which, as you heard her say, when she finished, she was really satisfied with the way it looked. The first two pictures, this picture and the one I'll show you in a minute, she did these just for me and my sister. When she was about 50, she went back to these memory pictures. She had always talked about her experiences. My mother, unlike many other Holocaust survivors, my mother couldn't not tell her story. And I always heard her stories. I can't remember when I didn't know her stories. But when she reached this point in her life, as I said, when she was about 50, she decided she wanted me and my sister to see what her home and her family looked like. So after she did this picture, she gave it to me. And then if you do the next slide, please. Then she created a companion piece for my sister. And this is the view from the other side of the road of my mother and her brother swimming in the river, and her sisters along the banks of the river with the cows and the ducks and the geese. And in both these pictures, she's remembering a life that was very happy. They were very poor people, but they had joy in their lives. If you go to the next slide, please. This is one of the pictures that she did, another one of the pictures that she did of her life before the war. The first two pictures that she did, she gave them to me and to my sister, and then she set them aside, or she set aside these memory pictures for about 10 years. My kids were born then, and she was making a lot of things for them. And actually, one of the things that she made for my daughter was a doll, a larger than life-size doll, which is part of the exhibition. So you'll see that at the museum. But she, in this picture, she remembered this Jewish holiday of Shavuos that usually falls in about June. And she and her brother and sisters were going to their grandparents' house. And her brother made her a pair of stilts. She used to say that her brother was the toy maker and she was the toy tester, because she was something of a tomboy. So here she is walking through the fields on the way to their grandparents' house. And my mother, to me, this picture, apart from its beauty, which I think is phenomenal, it also revealed so much of my mother's character, the way that she thought of herself and presented herself, because here she remembers herself standing head and shoulders above her brother and sisters, and she's leading the way. And I think that was very characteristic of my mother and in her behavior in general. And in this picture, she got so carried away with her embroidery of the wheat that she continued the embroidery in the border of the picture. And this is the only picture that she did that has these stalks of wheat or any embroidery in the border. And you'll also notice as I go through these that she used the border colors as a way of delineating chapters of her life. So all of the pictures that took place during the war years are bordered in black. The pictures that she did before the war and after the war, she used different colors. And in this picture, this is the only picture that she did with this particular color blue. And it's so incredibly rich and vivid. I think in the next picture, we have a detail. Yeah, you can see the very intricate stitching in the wheat. She couldn't stop doing that. And then of course she matched the border to the cornflowers growing among the wheat stalks. Next picture, please. This is now the arrival of the war. My mother was 12 years old in 1939 when the Germans invaded Poland, and they came straight to her village. And here she remembers standing at her grandparents' house, which was at the entrance to the village, and watching with a couple of her friends as a troop of German soldiers rode up on horseback. And one of them dismounted and pulled her grandfather, standing on the steps of his house, pulled him off the steps and cut off his beard. Any man who was wearing a beard was automatically assumed to be Jewish because only Jewish men wore beards. So here my mother watches as this German soldier cuts off her grandfather's beard. And this is the way the war began for my mother. Next slide, please. Yeah, here's the detail of it. Next slide, please. So the Germans actually occupied her village for 3 years until October 1942. And in the earlier years of the occupation, things were terrible, but not as terrible as they were to become in the later years. So this is July 1940. So about 8 months or so after they arrived, less than that. But my mother one day developed this terrible toothache. And she had heard that there was a dentist in the German camp. She knew, though, that she couldn't go there just as herself. And if she were to talk to one of the German soldiers, she could speak German, but with a Yiddish accent. So she knew she would be turned away if she went there as a Jewish girl. So she got a Polish friend of hers to go with her, and she taught her how to say in German, "My sister has a toothache." And so here she remembers sitting while the dentist took out her tooth, and you can see it better in the next slide. Here the dentist is pulling her tooth, and afterward he gave her a piece of chocolate, presumably because she had been a good patient. And then she went home and told her mother what she had done. She never told either of her parents beforehand what she was planning to do, because she knew they would never have allowed her to do it. And when she told her mother what she had done, she said that her mother was so shocked that she had had the nerve to go up to the dentist. But then my mother, when she would tell the story, my mother couldn't believe that she had the nerve to do it herself. So, but later on, this was actually a kind of foreshadowing of what she was to do later on to save her life. Next slide, please. This is now in June of 1941. And by this point, the Jews were no longer allowed to own livestock, which was really devastating in her family, because her father was a horse trader. He used to travel around the countryside buying and selling horses. And her mother used to raise poultry, ducks and geese and chickens to sell at market. So the two older girls were hired out to Polish farmers as farmhands. And so here on this beautiful day in June, my mother and her sister decided to take the cows that they were tending down to this good pasture near the Vistula River. And when they got there, my mother could see through that line of trees that they were next to this labor camp, the Yanishev labor camp, which before the war had actually been a prison camp for Polish prisoners, but had been turned into a slave labor camp by the Germans for young Jewish men and boys, rebuilding this earthen dam which would get flooded every spring. So here my mother could see through the trees, she could see these boys and men working. And in the foreground, you could go to the next slide, please, Becca. In the
Oh, sorry.
I think there's one more, maybe not. Sorry. Let's go back to that picture. I thought I had included the detail. At any rate, in the foreground on the bottom left side of the picture, one of the soldiers is leading this young boy into the woods. presumably he could no longer work. He was exhausted. And there my mother heard shots coming from the woods. This picture, and really when you see this in person, it's just an incredible experience. Every single blade of grass is a separate stitch. My mother just immersed herself in the beauty of the landscape, in creating the beauty of the landscape. And so you see on the one side of this picture, it's this beautiful pastoral scene of lush grass and the animals and these two girls and the trees bearing fruit and flowers growing. And on the other side is this scene of terror and brutality, almost devoid of color. And so when I saw this picture, I was really awestruck, because to me, it captures the reality of war from the perspective of those who lived through it. And for my mother, the war was, or life was, still contained beauty as well as the horror of war. When I showed this picture to a group of a class of fourth graders and asked them what they thought about it, one boy raised his hand and said, "This picture tells me that there's a thin line between good and evil." A really insightful observation coming from a 9-year-old boy. Next picture, please. So this is now October 1942, to be precise, October 15th, 1942. The Germans were on their way to implementing the final solution, the extermination of all the Jews of Europe, and this was part of the plan. And so on this day, they ordered all the Jews of my mother's village and the whole area around it to report to a nearby train station. They didn't tell them where they were going to go, but having lived under 3 years, through 3 years of occupation, my mother knew it was going to be terrible. And she didn't want to go. She was 15 by this point. And so the night before they were to leave their homes, my mother begged her parents to think of somebody that they could go to, a farmer that they could work for, as they had been, who was a friend of her father's. And the next morning, she and her sister are getting ready to leave their family. Everyone is crying as they say goodbye. Her father tells her, gives her the name of a friend of his, Stefan, who lives in another village. And so my mother and Manya are going to go to Stefan's house. Manya didn't want to go. She was 13 at the time. She just wanted to stay with the family. But finally, their mother told her, "Manya, go with Esther." And my mother always said about this picture that it was the most difficult one for her to do. It was one of the first ones that she did, but it was not technically difficult for her, but emotionally very difficult for her, because this is the last time she saw most of her family. And so their memory was still so powerful for her as she created this picture. And the next picture, please. Here they are saying goodbye. And everyone is crying. There are tears on everyone's faces. Next picture, please. As difficult as that first farewell picture was, my mother went back to the same scene 10 years later. That was one of the first pictures she did. This was one of the last pictures she did. And over that roughly 10-year period, you could see how much her technique and style had evolved. She learned perspective, and she was, this is a much more complex composition than the slide I just showed you. But interestingly, in this picture, my mother and Manya are almost out of the picture. She, and you can see these three small figures in the distance. Their mother had hired a neighbor to take Esther and Manya to Stefan's house. So here they are walking with the neighbor, receding into the background. And in the foreground, she has her mother and father leaving their house. Her brother is standing by the wagon, and the two younger girls are already in the wagon. And what's really fascinating to me, one of the things that's really fascinating to me, is that my mother imagined this scene. She has her back to most of it. So she's imagining what it was like from her parents' perspective to be getting into the wagons and saying goodbye. Next picture, please. As it turned out, the neighbor who was supposed to take them to Stefan's house kind of abandoned them. And my mother got very worried because she knew that, well, she was worried that the neighbor had gone to turn them into the Germans, because you could get, at that time, if you turned in a Jew, you could get a bounty, sugar or some other kinds of foodstuffs. And so my mother took Manya and they went back to the road and joined everyone on the road going to Krasnik, where the train station was. And here they met up with a cousin of theirs who was walking with her baby, their cousin Dina. And once Manya saw Dina, she just wanted to stay there because she wanted to be reunited with their parents. But my mother, when they reached this point in the road, my mother realized they were soon going to be in Krasnik, and she just balked. She couldn't bear the thought of continuing. So she started to pull Manya off the road to go to Stefan's house. But Manya wanted to stay with Dina, and it wasn't until Dina said to Manya, "Go with Esther," that Manya listened and went with Esther. And I always would say that the reason my aunt survived, Manya, was because she listened both to Dina and their mother. And the reason my mother survived was because she didn't listen. Two very different personalities. Next slide, please. Here they are, these two girls. When you see the pictures when you see all of the pictures, whether in the gallery or online, notice that Esther and Manya are wearing, she used the same fabric from one picture to another for continuity of the clothes of the dresses that they were wearing. So she was very mindful that she was telling a story here. Next picture. So here they are, they arrive in Stefan's house in Dombrova, and they fall upon him as he opens the door, and they tell him who they are. And he tells them not to worry, and he takes them in, and he puts them up in his attic, stringing tobacco leaves, and he keeps them for a couple of days. But then after the third day, they come down for breakfast, and they see that their baskets are packed, and they tell him, and he tells them rather, that they can't stay, that everybody in their village knows that they came to him, and if the Germans come, they'll kill him and they'll kill the girls and they'll burn his house, and they have to leave. So they go out into the pouring rain, and until they come to these woods, and the sun comes out, and they're hiding in the woods there, drying their boots. And it was at this point that my mother realized that they could not survive under their own identities as Hersch's daughters. And so she made up these identities for them as these two Polish Catholic farm girls from a town on the other side of the river, and names, very Polish names, Josefina and Maria Grochowiecka, and this whole backstory of being separated from their family and looking for work. And so that was how they went off, continuing on the road. But I want to just remark here on this extraordinary picture. In this one piece of fabric, in this one composition, my mother describes events that took place in different locations and at different times. Arriving at Stefan's house, up in the attic, leaving Stefan's house on the road, and then hiding in the woods. And she manages to tell this multi-part story in one composition. It's really quite extraordinary. And remember also, my mother had never done anything like this before in her life, but she figured out how she was going to tell her story. Next slide, please. So after they came to one village and then another village, but people just were not willing to keep them unless they could show papers who they were, which of course they didn't have. But finally they came to this village, Grabowka, where people were willing to take them in without papers. And my mother found work with this old farmer whose wife was infirm, and he needed help around his farm. And so she became his housekeeper and farmhand. She did everything that needed to be done. And Manya found work with another family just across the road. And my mother called the farmer Dziadek, which is Polish for grandfather. And here on this picture, my mother is tending the garden that she had planted. And one day, these German soldiers came and trampled right through the garden and started trying to talk to my mother. And she just kept her head down. She just didn't want to engage with them at all. And Dziadek came out and stood there, kind of looking after her, when suddenly the bees, which the farmer kept, started swarming, came out of their hives and started swarming around the German soldiers. And they couldn't understand why they were bothering them and not my mother or Dziadek. And so finally the bees actually drove off the soldiers, doing what no one else could do, driving the Nazis away. And my mother was always sort of tickled by the fact that this was the day that the bees saved her. But you can see here too how she didn't leave out any detail of the beauty of the landscape. Each blade of grass is a stitch, the flowers, the fruit growing in the trees. And the next slide. The bees. Look how perfect every single one of these bees is. I was just stunned. Each wing, the striped bodies, just amazing, the level of detail. My mother, she was a true documentarian. She felt like she needed to capture exactly what she could recall in her memory. She didn't want to leave out a single detail, no matter how small. And in the exhibit at AVAM, everyone fell in love with the bees. Mm-hmm. And Rebecca hung a sort of a string of bees right next to the picture. And also right next to the picture, in its own case, is this old-fashioned porcelain cup. In 1999, when my mother and my family and I went back to Poland, it was my mother's first return visit there since the war ended. We went to Grabowka, And we saw there these women who had been her friends, girls, when she was living there. One of them was living in Jadik's house. And as we were talking, as my mother was talking to her, she went back into her house and she came out with this porcelain cup, which had been the cup from which Jadik had his coffee every morning. My mother used to bring him his coffee in this cup. And my mother begged her, this woman, Chela, to give her the cup. And she brought it back from Poland with her. It was the only thing that she ever had from her life before the war or during her life in Poland. And so now it is resident next to the picture of Jadik and the bees. It's really just an incredible memento of that time. So the Russians rather came through in 1944 and liberated the village as they were moving westward to Germany. And so my mother waited a couple of months in Grabovka, and then she was very eager. She was waiting for the battles to be safely moved on. And so then she went back to Nishik, her village, to see if anyone had survived, if anyone had come back. And of course, no one had. And she asked her neighbors if they knew where the Jews had gone to. And they didn't, but one of them thought that maybe they had been taken to this concentration camp called Majdanek, which was in Lublin, the city of Lublin, not terribly far or close enough for my mother to travel to on her own. And so here you see her at the entrance to the camp in her yellow dress. I always thought she looked like Dorothy on the road to Oz. And you can see this is in July of 1944. And even though she's entering this hell, she still remembers the flowers that were blooming underneath the barbed wire fence at the entrance to the camp. This is tremendously compressed because it's a very, very large camp. But she wanted to include in this one picture the gas chambers and the crematorium and other barracks that are part of the camp and some of the Russian soldiers. The Russians had liberated the camp and they gave her a tour. And this was the first time she saw for herself what the Germans had done during the war in these concentration camps. And she saw at the back, at the top of the picture, there's a field of giant cabbages growing on a bed of human ashes. And after my mother got this tour, she joined the Polish army, which was under Red Army command. And she went with the army all the way to Berlin. And actually, she was 17 years old. And by the time the war ended, she was already a sergeant in the army.
Bernice, really quick, someone is asking about the text on the logs and in this picture, if you want to talk about that.
The text and the canister, there are canisters in the back.
Okay, yeah.
There are canisters in front of a pile of ash, and they say Buchenwald, which was a completely different camp. But apparently the Germans would sell, because there were German prisoners who were taken to Buchenwald, like political prisoners. So the Germans would sell these canisters of ash to the families of people, of prisoners at Buchenwald, and tell them that these were the remains of their family.
Thank you.
So after the war ended, my mother went back to Poland to get Manya, and the two of them went back to Germany to a displaced persons camp, a DP camp, which is where my mother met my father, and my aunt met her husband, who is also a survivor from Poland, and everybody, and they both got married there, and there were lots of weddings actually in this camp. Everybody, many of the people there were young people who were so desperately eager to create new lives for themselves. And my father had relatives in New York, so they applied to immigrate to the United States. My father found work while they were waiting for visas. He found work in Belgium. And so my mother joined him there, and that's where I was born. And here we are, arriving in June 1949, arriving in New York City, where my father's cousin, who had helped sponsor our immigration, she met us there, and I am that little blop in pink on my father's shoulder. And here we are standing in front of the Statue of Liberty. And my mother recalled my father's cousin, Clara. When she looked at me sleeping in my father's arms, she turned to me and said, "My dear child, this will be your America." The next picture, please. And this is the last in the narrative story of my mother's journey. This is the backyard of the house in which we lived in Brooklyn, our first house. And there was this old overgrown sour cherry tree in the backyard. And my mother, who was a fantastic cook, saw so many possibilities in the sour cherries there. She used to make pies and compotes and blintzes and pierogi, and she even made cherry vodka from the cherries. But so she would very eagerly climb up to the tree. If you would go to the next slide, you can see her there hidden in the leaves. And she would pass these buckets of cherries down to me and my sister. And she included in the picture this neighbor boy watching there. My sister and I were the envy of all the kids in the neighborhood because our mother could climb trees. So if you can go back up. Mm-hmm. My mother, in the caption to the story, to this picture rather, she recalled that when she was a little girl, she would sit with her grandmother, and her grandmother would say, "Esther, when you grow up, you're going to go to America, because in America, money grows on trees." And then she would say, "But Grandma, I'm really good at climbing trees." And so every time she climbed this tree, she would remember this conversation with her grandmother. So this picture and many others are in the exhibition. You can see them online on our website, artandremembrance.org. They're all on display at AVAM, and I would really encourage you to go to see the original pieces. They're incredibly beautiful and impressive in person. Can you go to the next slide, please?
Sure.
Beyond. This is what if you haven't seen it, this is what the gallery looks like. It's even a little bit larger. And in the centerpiece is a recreation of Esther's house. When Rebecca told me what her ideas were for this latest installation, because this is the third time that Esther's work has been exhibited at AVAM. And so for this exhibition, she had this idea to create Esther's house. And she has, you can see the cow and the dog and these lace curtains in the window and a kind of thatched roofing there. And I don't have a picture of this, but I will just tell you, on the left, on the right side of the screen, you can see the benches for seating there, but this is where there's a setup for the screening of the film, of the documentary film, which runs on a loop. And when we were there for the opening, my son was taking pictures, and it so happened that he got a picture when there was a scene from the film in which my mother was speaking. It was reflected on the window of the house on the right. So in this photograph, which I'm sorry I don't have to show you, but in this photograph, Esther is looking out the window. It's just otherworldly. And of course, it just reaffirmed for us Esther's presence in this way and others. But it reaffirmed for us her presence in this space. It was really quite stunning. Anyway, it's beautiful whether Esther is in the window or not. But the entire exhibition is beautiful and very true to what we wanted to do with my mother's work. If you go to the next slide. I mentioned that we have a nonprofit organization, Art and Remembrance. My sister and I created it a couple of years after my mother died with the intention of bringing my mother's artwork out into the world. But we always envisioned that we wanted to place her work in the context of other stories of social injustice, generally speaking, and certainly stories of other genocides and just difficult stories of social injustice in the world. And so this was, and one of the reasons why we've been at AVAM 3 times, because we share Rebecca's vision for what she wants the museum to be. And so in this exhibition, Rebecca included these paintings of Rwanda. This is a scene of genocide in a painting by an artist named Lily Ye, who went there to Rwanda to work with villagers there. There are also works that were done for the Truth and Reconciliation Commission of women in South Africa. And the next picture I want to show you was actually done by a woman in a workshop that we sponsored, Art and Remembrance sponsored in Santa Fe, New Mexico, with immigrants who, some of them were students in an English language learning class at the community college. But we've been doing programs with immigrants, inviting them after they learned about my mother and her artwork. We invited them to create their own stories of their journeys to America, the life that they left behind, the life that they looked forward to creating in the United States. And this was done by a woman who is from Guatemala, who describes coming to the United States and being so excited to see snow for the first time and then finding work, only to be told that she was working as a preschool teacher. And one of her colleagues one day accused her of stealing work from real people and told her she should be working in the fields. So she did this picture, the upper right-hand corner, to honor the people who did work in the fields. And she describes this in the written caption below. So this is so true to our vision of how not only we want to tell my mother's story, but we want to use my mother's story to inspire other people to tell their stories and to share those stories more widely. And that's why this is the perfect home and the perfect exhibition for Esther's spirit today. And if you could go to the next. Yes, so this is just so you'll have it in your head. This is our organization, artandremembrance.org. You can go to our website, learn more about what we're doing, see Esther's work there in the gallery, Fabric of Survival Gallery, and also see the documentary film from there. So with that, I will turn now to any questions, comments from all of you. And let me thank you once again for the great honor of being able to share this with you on today, International Holocaust Remembrance Day.
Thank you so much, Bernice. There's a lot of comments coming in the chat. I hope you can see them. One question that did come up, which is a common question, is how long did it take Esther to create each piece, or like how long was she working on them?
Yeah, this is the number one most asked question. So I'm really happy to get it tonight. It varied. You know, I watched my mother as she was creating these pieces. We would have dinner together every Sunday. And so, but I estimate that on average, she did roughly 36 pieces over roughly a 10-year period. Well, she did 30 pieces, let's say, over roughly a 10-year period. So anyway, they took her on average between 3 and 4 months to work on. And one thing to remember about my mother, while she was doing this, she owned a women's clothing store in Frederick, Maryland. So she created most of these while she was also running a business. She was remarkably quick.
So many stitches too. Like she just must be, so fast and so precise. You really have to see these works in person to see the level of detail.
Yeah, every stitch in the bee picture and the one of what I call heaven and hell, the two girls and next to the labor camp, each blade of grass is a stitch of thread. It's really, really wonderful.
Let's see, getting a lot of thank yous in our chat. If anyone has any other questions, feel free to put those in the chat for us while we have a few minutes here. Thank you for sharing this work. I'm wondering if your mom ever saw herself as an artist, because she surely was.
She surely was. But no, she never thought of herself as an artist. I'm not exactly sure what I think she thought of artists as people who had lots of training and who knew how to draw, who could render very realistic images. And that's not at all what my mother did. I think she had great confidence in her stitching. She knew that's why she even attempted this in the first place. She knew she could sew anything, but she never thought of herself as art. She thought that she was telling the most important story of her life, but not as an artist, as a witness.
Wow. Did she use old fabrics from her past or whatever she had available?
That is a really good question. My mother paid a lot of attention. My mother bought fabric. Some of it may have been scraps that she had, but mostly she looked for fabric that could that she could use to create certain effects. So, for example, there are a lot of pictures that describe events in the fall. And so she needed to create fall, autumnal images with yellow and orange, red leaves. And she looked for fabric that would create that. There is another picture, I don't have it in my slides now, but she did a picture of a labor camp. I'm sorry, it wasn't a labor camp. It was young Jewish boys and girls who were put to work digging trenches, tank trenches. And she looked for fabric that would look like dug earth. And then she did stitches of very small round circles to look like stones that were turned up. But she was looking for something that would resemble dug earth. She looked for fabric that looked like a forest floor. So she paid a great deal of attention to finding fabric that could serve her pictorial images.
A question from Rebecca. Can you speak of the time her soldier colleagues were confiscating food from German families and what transcendent kindness, even to them, she performed?
Oh, yes. There are, unfortunately, there are many stories that my mother told me that she wasn't able to put into her pictures. She would have continued making many more pictures, I'm sure, if she had had the time to do it, but she died before she could really finish all the things that she had in her mind. The story that Rebecca's talking about, when my mother was in the army and she was with, they arrived in Germany, and she and a small group of Russian soldiers went off into the city to look for food and also to look for loot, I guess you could say. I think she was with just a couple of other soldiers. And, in some respect, it was a way of taking revenge by treating these Germans so vilely. So they went to this house, and there was an old couple and a young woman who had just given birth. And my mother saw, although she entered with a very different idea, when she saw this young woman who had just given birth and didn't have any milk to drink for herself, my mother left and went off in search of milk to bring back to this woman. So despite her thoughts of revenge, she actually couldn't repress her human sympathy, empathy for this young mother in need. And that was really, she always saw, even when she saw the worst in people, the very worst in people, she also saw the best in people. I'm just scrolling.
Oh, good.
Through here.
Yeah, I've really enjoyed this virtual tour. Your mother's work will be around and appreciated longer than we will, which is really touching.
Yes. My kids grew up, when my mother finished these pieces, as I said, she lived in Frederick. She and my father lived in Frederick, and my family and I lived in Chevy Chase. And so she would finish each piece and she would have the pictures stretched and she would give them to me. And I hung them on the walls of my house. And then I ran out of wall space eventually, and the pictures started stacking up. And that's when I knew I had to get them. I had to get them out of my house. So it's been just an incredible, I knew nothing about the art world. I really had no idea how to get them out of my house, but I did what I could, and here they are. There's a question about a book. Yes, we do have a book. It's called Memories of Survival. You can find it on our website and order it through Amazon, from Amazon, but you can also, if you come into the museum, the gift shop sideshow has copies of the book for sale. So I would certainly encourage you, when you make a visit to the museum, to pick up a copy from them. Oh, I started to say about my mother's work. Well, the comment about her work being around for longer than we will. I certainly hope so. But my children grew up with these pictures on the walls of our house. And so, and of course, they were very close to my mother. So I am very encouraged by the fact that after I'm gone, that they will continue to give the work its place in the world. I'll go down also. Yes. Yeah, great. I see all the comments. One that I wanted to mention, Claire Tesh, who is a friend and colleague, has worked with us on putting together lesson plans and other educational resources that are also available on our website. And I would really encourage you, if you are an educator or know of an educator, I would really encourage you to take a look at the material, because it's just incredibly rich. Really, Claire did just a really outstanding job in pulling together the resources that we had and creating whole new ones too. So we've done, with AVAM, we've done a couple of programs for educators that were really very successful, I think.
And we have done a few virtual educator workshops in partnership with Bernice and Claire, and those are on our YouTube channel if you're interested in learning more, diving a little deeper into the Esther story and subject matter.
Yeah, great.
Let's see, who taught your mother her needlework skills, and did she teach you, Bernice?
My mother was actually, she learned embroidery in school, because when she was a little girl, that kind of handwork was taught in school to girls. And but my mother was also apprenticed to a dressmaker when she was 8 years old, and she learned a great deal more about sewing from her teacher than the local seamstress. So she actually was well taught, and she was an incredible student, because she loved to do it. She used to beg her mother for scraps of fabric so she could do her embroidery. Right. That's why I say she was very confident of her needlework skills. Did she teach me? A little bit, but it wasn't this. It didn't have the same didn't bring me the same kind of joy that it brought my mother, and I just wasn't as adept at it, anywhere near as adept. People often ask me whether I acquired my mother's needlework skills, and I say my mother's skill was to create these pictures, and mine was to bring them out into the world. So we just have complementary skills.
That's exactly. And
Someone asked, were you going to?
Oh no, go ahead, Bernice. You can read it.
Someone asked whether my mother felt guilty surviving and having a happy life. It had to have been painful surviving something like that. I don't think my mother, she felt guilty to some extent because she survived, she said, because she was selfish. She was only thinking of herself. But of course, she wouldn't have survived if that weren't the case. So she felt guilty that I think she couldn't have saved everyone, although she saved her sister as well as herself. I don't think she felt guilty about having a good life. I think she felt that that's why she had lived, so that she could have some happiness in her life, and that she could have a family again in her life. So yes, it was painful to survive. It was painful to survive. But I think she tried to be happy.
Bernice, Rebecca had a comment that you share about your mother's strongly intuitive nature. And you also, your intuitive nature as well.
Well, I think, we did a program in November, I guess it was. It was about, it related to the exhibition on sleep. And I talked about a couple of the pictures, my mother's pictures, which I did not talk about tonight, but are again in the gallery and online, of two very, very powerful dreams that my mother had. And they were actually, when she went back to these memory pictures, the first two pictures she created were both of dreams that she had had during the war. One of her mother, who came to her and pulled her out of the house where she was staying and told her, and was running. And when she asked her mother why they were running, her mother said, because the sky is falling. And when it touches the ground, we'll die. And my mother looked behind her to see these pieces of black sky falling. And that's one of her dreams. And so this was what she was immediately drawn to when she decided to go back to these pictures, was to share these dreams, because they were so powerful. And when I was little, when I was a child, I had a couple of times, I had these prescient dreams that I told my mother about. And my mother always believed me. I mean, she knew that there was something to, I was really young. In one case, I was 5, and I had a dream that a ring that I had lost was behind the refrigerator. And my mother moved the refrigerator because she believed that I was seeing something. And sure enough, the ring was there. So she believed in things that were unseen, but deeply felt. And I suppose that's part of how I am too. her recipes. My mother was a fantastic cook. I didn't mention this earlier, but when she was in the Polish army under Russian command, you know, the supreme commander of the Red Army was Marshal Zhukov. And my mother wound up cooking blini, or in Yiddish we call it blintzes, but she wound up cooking blini for Marshal Zhukov because she was that good a cook. And she would make these prodigious dinners. She would say, if you would tell her she was a good cook, she'd say, well, I can cook. She said, my mother, she was a great cook because she could make a great meal from nothing. She said, I have good food, but my mother could make good meals from nothing. So anyway, one of the things, she was a great baker as well as cook. And one of the things that she made that we loved were these rugelach. And Rebecca has always been interested in my mother's cooking and what she could cook. And so she created these little recipe cards for rugelach, for Esther's rugelach, that are in the gallery. So when you're there, I would encourage you to pick up the recipe card. They're delicious, I guarantee it.
All right, well, we probably have time for one more question if anybody has anything else before we sign off. Bernice, I could listen to you talk for hours about.
Well, that's the way I felt about my mother.
Yeah.
My mother was a really such a gifted storyteller.
Yeah.
And we could sit for hours, I could sit for hours listening to her stories. And of course, there were many stories that I heard over and over and over again. But I didn't mind because in fact, I looked forward to it because her stories were so amazing, and her way of telling them was so incredibly engaging.
And I mean, seeing her work, and I know students seeing her work are just get empowered to share their stories and, you know, depict these moments in their lives, you know, that they can remember, and just put that on paper, on fabric, or any way they want to show it. It's amazing.
And that's been one of the great things that has been especially gratifying to me when we invite these groups of immigrants, students, English language learners, or teenagers to tell their stories, and the kinds of stories that emerge when people feel like they've been invited. Because we had this one woman in a workshop who, these were all women from Central America, and one of them told the story of having to climb over this fence to get into the country. I mean, it was just an incredibly powerful and painful story. And she was in tears as she was telling it, and she did a story cloth picture of it. And then she told me later that she had never, these women were all her friends in this group. She had never told any of them the story before because no one had ever asked her. And so this was the first time she had been asked, and it was the first time she could tell. And she said, telling these stories unlocks my heart. What can you say after that? That's so incredibly gratifying.
Let's see.
Yes, I completely agree with Rebecca. Becca and Mavette do an absolutely awesome job. They are so great to work with, and they are so good at what they do.
Rebecca was holding up her finger. I didn't know if she had one more comment
Just
for
wanted
us.
to say, Lily Ye, who spent that time with the survivors camp doing this incredible, when the people who survived, the killing in Rwanda, there was no honorable place for their dead. There were just big pits that were, so she did this thing with the village to make a beautiful place for all of the dead to be disinterred and to be wrapped with messages of love, all the bones that were left. I mean, it was a very amazing project. So she was really dealing with traumatized people. And she said that she had taken from our museum, from a previous show, your book on your mother's work, and that here in Rwanda, that it was so meaningful to the people there what your mother had done to tell her story. So isn't that incredible? I mean, just how much your mother's spirit and experience and goodness has spread because of your work, Bernice, all over the world.
It's phenomenal. She could never have imagined this. This was not what she ever envisioned, and yet she reached all these people in such a deeply personal way. Yeah, it's amazing, really amazing. I just want to thank, I really appreciate everyone being here this evening. I really appreciate all your comments, your questions and comments. And I hope that one day, this is not such a remote thing, I hope that one day we'll be able to meet at AVAM and I can take you through the other pictures that I haven't shared with you, because this is so near and dear to my heart.
And thank you so much, Bernice, for taking the time and sharing her story. Once again, we hope to do more programs like this in the future. Thanks everyone for joining us tonight. Check out our website, avm.org, for more upcoming virtual programs. And again, we are open Wednesday through Sunday. So come see this work in person if you're able. So thanks everyone. Have a good evening.
Thank you. Thank you so much.